Hello, my name is Karina Allen. I'm the Chief Hazards Geologist at the Washington Geological Survey, Department of Natural Resources. I'm going to be talking to you today about tsunami hazards in Washington, what the impacts may be for our coastlines and our communities. Carrie talked about Washington geological history and the geologic evidence for past tsunamis and earthquakes in our state. Another way that we learn about tsunami hazards is from experience. The two most recent and devastating tsunami events in recent memory are the 2011 Japan earthquake and tsunami and the 2004 Sumatra earthquake and tsunami. These events killed thousands and hundred thousands of people and caused millions and billions of dollars of economic loss in the communities that were impacted. These events are a devastating reminder of the potential for earthquakes and tsunamis that can happen on our coastline. Tsunamis are caused primarily by three ways: earthquakes, landslides, and volcanic eruptions. These are all possible in Washington state and have all happened in our past. Today, I'm going to be primarily focusing on earthquake-sourced tsunamis. Tsunamis involve multiple waves. The first tsunami wave may not be the biggest in the series. In fact, in the Puget Sound, oftentimes the second, third, or fourth tsunami wave is the largest because of our complicated coastline and the way that the waves refract and bounce off of the islands and small, narrow passages. Tsunami waves are huge in width, length, and depth. The tsunami may not cease for hours to days. Tsunamis create powerful currents that cause damage and carry large hidden objects within them. You cannot swim or even surf through a tsunami. Tsunamis cannot be predicted. We know what types of earthquakes can cause them, but not when the earthquakes will happen. Tsunami impacts for Washington coastline have varying degrees of impact depending on the bathymetry or the shape of the ocean floor beneath the water and the topography on land, whether it's a steep bluff or coastline or a low-lying river valley. In addition to that, the tsunami waves can be dampened by vegetation or other aspects of the built environment. In addition to the main earthquake, which can cause the tsunami, these large earthquakes are also commonly followed by hundreds of aftershocks. This image on the right shows each of these beach balls is an example of one earthquake that happened during the 2011 Japan earthquake sequence. This largest event here is the magnitude 9.1 earthquake. You can see here that in the days leading up to the event, there were smaller earthquakes, and we call these foreshocks. Then the main earthquake happened, and in the following 10 days, each of these dots represents an earthquake that happened, or an aftershock. In this table, I'm showing large earthquakes in our history and the number of magnitude 6 or greater aftershocks that happen. This is important because these aftershocks could potentially also cause tsunamis, but also for the first responders and the people who live in these communities to know that there will be following earthquakes after the large event. The main earthquake that is talked about for tsunami hazards in Washington, and Carrie talked about this as well, is the Cascadia Subduction Zone. It's about 700 miles long off the coast of Washington, Oregon, and California, and it goes all the way up into Canada. It breaks about every 500 years on average, and the last great rupture was in 1700. That means there's about a 10 to 15% chance that we will have one of these big earthquakes in the next 50 years. This earthquake will be felt region-wide, and the shaking will last 3 to 6 minutes. This is very important to understand because when I'm going to be showing you the tsunami modeling and the estimated wave arrival times for specific locations, we reference that to the start of the earthquake. And so if you think about the earthquake initiating and then the earthquake shaking lasting for up to 6 minutes, in some locations on the shore, the wave will arrive within 15 minutes. So that's only 10 minutes after the ground stops shaking. In order to do tsunami modeling, we have to figure out what the earthquake looks like. And scientists do this based on our known record of past earthquakes from geologic evidence and offshore evidence of turbidites, as Carrie talked about in the last presentation. There's been a great paper done by Rob Witter and others in 2011 who looks at the number of known earthquakes that have happened in the past 10,000 years and about how big they were. So he categorized them by t-shirt sizes: small, medium, large, and extra large. And this is the magnitude over here. They're all very large earthquakes. Even the small earthquake is a magnitude 8.7. For our purposes in Washington state, we use the large earthquake, or the L1 event. And this is a magnitude 9 earthquake that ruptures the entire length of the Cascadia subduction zone. We also do tsunami modeling from crustal faults. The main one that we look at is the Seattle fault. This is a complicated fault strand that trends east-west across the Seattle and Bainbridge Island area. And there are numerous strands of this fault. I'm going to take a zoomed in look here at Bainbridge Island at one of the most famously studied strands called the Toe Jam Hill Fault Strand. This is the aerial imagery of Bainbridge Island, and if we strip off the trees using a technology called LIDAR, or light detection and ranging, we're able to see this fault strand screaming across Bainbridge Island. And in the last great rupture of the Seattle fault earthquake, this is when this fault line broke Bainbridge Island and uplifted this point, as Carrie talked about in her presentation. We use a simplified Seattle fault trace for our modeling to understand what this potential tsunami impacts could be from the Seattle fault. All of Washington coastline is susceptible to tsunamis. Interestingly, some of the most notable tsunamis in our history and the recorded record have happened by landslides, both within the Puget Sound and within lakes across the state. Each of these stars represents a notable tsunami caused by a landslide in our state in the last 100 to 200 years. Now I'm going to start transitioning and talking to you about our tsunami modeling and what that means for coastal communities. We use the tsunami model that Carrie talked about and showed in her slide, where we simulate uplift offshore and earthquake subsidence, or depression in the land during the earthquake onshore. And then we allow the wave to propagate into the entire ocean column from the Cascadia subduction zone all the way to the outer coast, through the Strait of Juan de Fuca and into the Puget Sound, to understand what the tsunami inundation will look like in our coastal communities. This image on the right is a picture of the Cape Disappointment Ilwaco area along the southern end of the Long Beach Peninsula, just overlaying what the tsunami inundation would look like on today's topography. Tsunami modeling can help us estimate wave arrival times, tsunami wave amplitude, so the height of the wave offshore, tsunami inundation, the height of the water over the previously dry land, tsunami run-up, which is the distance the tsunami wave will travel inland, the duration of the tsunami wave action, and tsunami current velocity. This graphic shows the difference between tsunami amplitude, which is the height of the water out in the open ocean, versus inundation depth, which is the height of the water over the previously dry land or beach. And then run-up, or inundation extent, is the distance the tsunami wave will travel over the previously dry land. In order to do tsunami modeling, we have to make a few assumptions. The first one is that we simplify the fault model, so either the Cascadia subduction zone or the Seattle fault. We don't know what the next earthquake will look like. It may have very complicated slip, meaning it could break in the north, or it could start breaking in the south, and it could have more displacement in certain areas than others. And so we're not sure what that will look like. And so we take a conservative approach, and we have uniform slip over the entire fault length, and we simulate an earthquake over the entire fault length as well. We reference our results to mean high water. What this means that if when the next earthquake happens and it arrives on low tide or a king tide, the waves might be higher or lower than what we modeled in our simulation. We base our modeling on the best available topography and bathymetry data. And unfortunately, the waves are not able to interact with the buildings, the vegetation, or the built environment that we have today. We use what's called a bare earth model. So we strip off the existing vegetation topography, the existing vegetation and buildings, and let the tsunami wave travel over the bare earth. Ideally, we would be able to model this with all of those things in place, but we just don't have the computer power or the modeling infrastructure at this time, but we're hoping to get there. And lastly, we don't account for seismically induced landslides. This means that our models don't account for landslides that might cause secondary tsunamis during these events. All right, enough of that. Now I'm going to show you a cool tsunami wave simulation from a magnitude 9.0 Cascadia earthquake scenario, or the L1 event, on the Cascadia subduction zone. This simulation is going to show wave amplitudes, so the wave peaks and the wave troughs from this magnitude 9.0 earthquake. As the video plays, you will see wave amplitude on the left, with 10 feet or higher being the warm colors and 10 feet or lower being the cool colors. And you're going to see the time since the earthquake initiated on the bottom left. This is a disclaimer saying that our model cuts off on Vancouver Island, so don't use this simulation to estimate wave arrival times for Canada. For those of you not familiar with Washington, here we are in between Canada and Oregon on the Washington Peninsula. We're simulating a magnitude 9 earthquake now, and this is the wave traveling towards the outer coast, hitting in about 15-20 minutes. You can see the wave front propagating through the Strait of Juan de Fuca now. There's a leading trough here, followed by a crest. The leading wave front will split and go north into the San Juan Islands, Bellingham, and Anacortes, and then also at the same time go south into the Hood Canal, hitting Seattle at about 2.5 hours, Tacoma after that, and then you'll see the waves traveling and dissipating as they reach the southern Puget Sound, but making it all the way down to Olympia. Here we are 3.5 hours after the earthquake started, and you can see there's still significant waves happening along the outer coast and in some of these narrow inlets and passageways. This is Discovery Bay, where Carrie talked about tsunami deposits during her presentation. These narrow bays and inlets are kind of like a tsunami magnet because they capture the waves and they're able to record these tsunami deposits quite well. We're also able to study and simulate tsunami current velocity. This is a simulation, again, for a magnitude 9.0 Cascadia earthquake, but this time I'm going to be showing currents. That's the speed at which the water travels, and we use knots. And a knot is about 1.15 miles per hour. The darker purple colors represent higher speeds, and the more yellow or peach colors represent lower speeds. The bottom right shows time since the earthquake initiated. Here we are in the southern San Juan Islands. And unfortunately, we don't have high resolution current velocity data for the whole state. So we're going to have to zoom in after the earthquake starts to the southern San Juan Islands and watch the tsunami approach the area. Here we are about 30 minutes after the earthquake starts, and the tsunami is beginning to approach the area. You can see that there's an increase in current velocity as the first tsunami wave arrives. The narrow waterways between the islands and within these bays and harbors is where you'll notice the current speeds are the strongest. You can see whirlpools and eddies develop, and unfortunately they seem to follow the ferry lines, and this is also where you see lots of recreational boaters because these islands are beautiful to visit. In both this simulation and the last that I showed, this is sped up about 300 times so that you can understand what this looks like over a period of hours. Now I'm going to show you some tsunami inundation and approximate wave arrival times for these select locations. So we have a variety of locations along the outer coast, some along the Strait of Juan de Fuca, up into Bellingham, along Whidbey Island, Everett, in Seattle at the Great Wheel, Port of Tacoma, Olympia, and in Belfair. These inundation and wave arrival times are in reference to the start of the earthquake, as I mentioned in a previous slide. The estimated inundation depths are for the select locations that I chose, but the inundation may continue much farther inland than the specific location that I'll show in the next table. These are scenario based on this magnitude 9.0 Cascadia earthquake. The next earthquake may create bigger or smaller tsunami waves than the ones that I will show you here. There are publications available with the information for many of these locations. And for the others in the Puget Sound and Strait of Georgia areas, we're going to be releasing a publication that has details about this in early 2021. So I'm not going to read each of these to you, but what I'll show you is that for areas on the outer coast, Long Beach, La Push, Ocean Shores, Hoh, Tuhola, and Nia Bay, the first Cascadia subduction zone wave arrives in about 15 to 20 minutes. And the approximate inundation depths range from about 15 feet to over 60 feet in one location, with the average being about 30 feet. For areas like Port Angeles and Port Townsend in the Strait of Juan de Fuca, it takes about an hour and 40 minutes, and inundation depths are about 10 to 15 feet. In Whidbey Island and Everett and the northern part of the Puget Sound, the wave arrives in about 2 hours, and inundation depths are lower in these locations at about 2 feet. Down in Seattle and Tacoma area, the wave arrives in about 2.5 hours. And depending on where you are, the wave inundation depth is about 2 to 10 feet. And then down in Olympia, the first wave arrives at about 4 hours and 15 minutes. This is a good example of a location where the maximum wave is definitely not the first one, because the maximum wave arrives at about 10 hours after the start of the earthquake, and the inundation there is about 2 feet. For some of these locations in red, we have estimated inundation from a Seattle fault event. For these areas, Seattle in particular, the Seattle fault earthquake will generate a tsunami, which will arrive in the downtown Seattle waterfront within just minutes. And the inundation depth is expected to be quite severe at about 27 feet in the downtown waterfront area and about 5 feet in the Port of Tacoma. We produce tsunami inundation maps like the one shown here to show wave arrival times, inundation maps, and these can be used for land use planning and mitigation. We also produce tsunami current velocity maps, such as the one shown here, which show how strong the currents will be for the select map areas. This is very useful if you're in the maritime community and you would like to know how strong the wave currents may be. We also work closely with communities to develop tsunami evacuation maps. The one shown here is for the Aberdeen, Hoquiam, and Cosmopolis area and shows the amount of time it will take to walk slowly out of the inundation area to high ground. The orange colors here are the different lengths of time it will take you to reach the high ground areas and the preferred routes to get there. In some cases, the time it takes to walk to safety is greater than the time for the wave to arrive. In those instances, you have to either run, or in some severe cases, there's no evacuation option and vertical evacuation is necessary. These tools are very helpful for emergency managers and the public to understand what the evacuation routes are and what options are needed in order to provide safe refuge for communities. We have all this information on our geologic information portal. The link is shown here, but you can also just type in Washington Geology Portal into your browser and you should be able to find it. What I'm showing here is all of the different available tsunami products. We show the existing mapped hazard area. We have tsunami walk maps and evacuation routes, as well as the location of tsunami sirens. I mentioned before that we're coming up with new modeling and mapping that shows tsunami inundation for Cascadia and the Seattle fault. This figure shows the extents of those models and the map plates that will be coming out in early 2021. Yesterday, we came out with a new tsunami hazards brochure. You can either copy this link or also just type in tsunami hazards in Washington State in your browser and you should be able to find it. It's full of great resources about what a tsunami is, tsunami hazards, knowing where to go, and how to find alert information. Thank you very much for taking the time to listen. Please type your questions into the chat box or email them to me directly.